The morning sun painted the village of Bokaro in shades of gold and amber. Women balanced clay pots on their heads, children chased each other between mud huts, and the smell of roasting plantains filled the air. But when Kofi appeared at the edge of the market square, the laughter stopped. His face told a story no one wanted to hear. A twisted scar ran from his left eye down to his chin, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-smile that looked more like a grimace. His clothes were patched and dusty from sleeping under the baobab trees. But it was the spoon he carried, a silver spoon on a leather cord around his neck, that made people whisper and turn away. "The cursed taster," an old woman muttered, spitting on the ground as Kofi passed. He didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. Cursed. Murderer. The man who killed Queen Alma. Kofi stopped at a food stall where a young woman named Efua was selling bean cakes. Her hands moved quickly, shaping the dough and dropping it into hot oil. The sizzle and pop reminded him of palace kitchens, of a life that felt like a dream now. "Sister, could you spare one for a hungry man?" Kofi asked, his voice rough from years of sleeping in the cold. Efua looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. How Kofi had been the royal taster, the king's most trusted servant. How he had failed to detect poison in Queen Alma's wine. How the queen had died choking and gasping while the entire court watched in horror. How King Osei, mad with grief, had taken a blade and carved his rage across Kofi's face before throwing him out of the palace. "My mother says you bring bad luck," Efua said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother is wise," Kofi replied, his scarred face catching the morning light. "But hunger doesn't care about luck." Efua hesitated. There was something in his eyes. Not the madness people whispered about, but a deep sadness that made her heart ache. She quickly wrapped a bean cake in a banana leaf and handed it to him. "Go, before someone sees." Kofi took the food and touched his silver spoon to it, a habit he couldn't break even after 5 years. The spoon had saved his life more times than he could count. In his wandering, he had learned the art of detecting poison from healers and herbalists who took pity on him. The spoon was his tool, his teacher, his only companion. He had been the royal taster once, the most trusted man in King Osei's palace. Every dish, every cup of wine, every piece of fruit that touched the king's lips had to pass through Kofi first. For 10 years, he had kept the king safe. For 10 years, he had been honored and respected. Until the night Queen Alma died. Kofi remembered it like yesterday. The feast had been magnificent, a celebration of the king and queen's 15th wedding anniversary. The great hall had been filled with nobles, chiefs, and foreign dignitaries. Kofi had tasted everything, the jollof rice rich with tomatoes and spices, the tender goat stew, the crispy fried fish, the sweet palm wine. Everything was safe. He had staked his life on it. But when Queen Alma lifted her golden cup to her lips and drank, her eyes went wide with terror. She clutched her throat, her face turning purple. The cup fell from her hands, clattering across the stone floor. She tried to speak, but only a horrible gasping sound came out. Kofi had rushed forward, but the guards held him back. He watched helplessly as the queen collapsed, convulsing. The royal healers worked frantically, but within minutes, Queen Alma was dead. The king's grief had been terrible to witness. Osei had cradled his wife's body, rocking back and forth, making sounds that didn't seem human. And then, slowly, his grief had turned to rage. "You!" The king's voice had cut through the chaos like a blade. His eyes fixed on Kofi. "You were supposed to protect her. You tasted everything." "My king, I did," Kofi started, but Osei wasn't listening. "You failed me," the king screamed. "My beloved is dead because of you." The guards had seized Kofi, forcing him to his knees. King Osei had stood over him, trembling with fury and anguish. "Let everyone know what happens to those who fail their king," Osei had said, his voice cold now, dead. He had taken a ceremonial dagger from his belt. Kofi closed his eyes, expecting death. Instead, he felt the blade slice across his face, from eye to chin. The pain was blinding. He heard himself scream, tasted his own blood. Throw him out, the king had ordered. Let him wear his failure on his face for the rest of his miserable life. If I ever see him again, I will kill him. They had dragged Kofi through the palace gates and left him bleeding in the dust. No trial. No questions. Just exile and pain and shame. For weeks, Kofi had wanted to die. He wandered the countryside, sleeping in ditches, begging for scraps. People took one look at his scarred face and turned away. He was marked, cursed, untouchable. But slowly something changed. The herbalist who cleaned his wound told him stories about poisons, how they worked, what they looked like, how to detect them. An old healer taught him about antidotes and remedies. Kofi began to learn, to study, to understand things he had never questioned before. And as he learned, he began to remember details from that terrible night. Details that didn't make sense. He remembered tasting the wine from the same pitcher the queen drank from. He remembered drinking a full cup himself to ensure it was safe. The pitcher had been clean, he would have died if it wasn't. So, how had the queen been poisoned? He remembered that the queen's cup, only her cup, had been filled by King Osei himself. A gesture of love that everyone had found touching. The king serving his beloved wife on their anniversary. He remembered the queen's golden cup, how it had gleamed in the torchlight, how it had been polished to perfection. He remembered Nkrumah, the king's chief advisor, presenting the cup to Osei just before the feast. I polished it myself, my king, Nkrumah had said. So, it would shine as brightly as your love for the queen. And Kofi remembered the look on Nkrumah's face when the queen fell. Not horror, not surprise. Something else. Something that, in 5 years of thinking about that night, Kofi had finally identified. Satisfaction. Now, sitting under a tree in Bakoro's market square, Kofi ate his bean cake slowly, savoring each bite. A commotion near the village center drew his attention. A messenger on horseback thundered into the square, his mount kicking up clouds of red dust. Hear the news, the messenger called, his voice carrying across the marketplace. King Osei celebrates the marriage of his daughter, Princess Adwoa, to Prince Kwame of the Northern Kingdom. A great feast will be held in 3 days' time. All citizens are welcome to witness this joyous union and share in the celebration. The villagers erupted in cheers. A royal wedding meant food, dancing, music, and celebration. It meant days of festivity. For poor villages like Bakoro, it meant a chance to see the splendor of the palace, to eat food they couldn't normally afford. But Kofi's hand tightened around his silver spoon until his knuckles turned white. The king was hosting another feast, another celebration. And if Kofi's suspicions were correct, another opportunity for Nkrumah to strike. Because Kofi had spent 5 years piecing together the truth. He had traveled to the Northern Kingdom, asking questions, listening to gossip. He had learned that Nkrumah's younger brother, Kweku, was the chief advisor to Prince Kwame's father, the Northern King. He had learned that for years, Nkrumah and Kweku had advocated for a union between the two kingdoms. The Northern Kingdom was rich in gold and warriors. The Southern Kingdom, King Osei's realm, was fertile and prosperous. Together, they would be unstoppable. But Queen Amma had opposed the idea. She believed in allowing Princess Adwoa to choose her own husband. She had been beloved by the people, and King Osei always listened to her counsel. With Queen Amma alive, the marriage alliance would never happen.
So she had to die.
And Kofi, the one person who might have discovered how she was really killed, had to be discredited and removed. The king's grief had made that easy. Too easy. Now, 5 years later, the marriage was happening. Princess Adwoa was marrying Prince Kwame. If the union was consummated, if children were born, the two kingdoms would eventually merge. But Kofi suspected Nkrumah wouldn't wait for eventually. If King Osei died at the wedding feast, Princess Adwoa would become queen. Married to a northern prince. Guided by advisors from both kingdoms, including Nkrumah and his brother. It was the perfect plan. And Kofi was probably the only person alive who could see it. He stood up, brushing crumbs from his ragged clothes. Efua watched him nervously from her stall. "Are you going to the capital?" she asked. "To the wedding?" Kofi nodded slowly. "I am." But the king exiled you. If he sees you. I know, Kofi said. He touched the scar on his face, feeling the rough ridge of damaged skin. Believe me, I know. Then why go? Kofi looked at her with those sad, knowing eyes. Because 5 years ago, I failed to save someone I was sworn to protect. I've spent every day since then learning how I failed. Learning the truth. He held up his silver spoon, letting it catch the sunlight. And now I have a chance to make things right. Maybe my last chance. You could die, Efua said. Yes, Kofi agreed. But I've been dead for 5 years already. At least this way, my death might mean something. He began walking toward the road that led to the capital city. Behind him, Efua called out, Wait! Kofi turned. She ran to him and pressed a small bundle into his hands, several bean cakes wrapped in cloth. For your journey, she said. And be careful. I don't think you're cursed. I think you're brave. It was the first kind thing anyone had said to Kofi in 5 years. He felt tears sting his eyes, but blinked them away. Thank you, sister, he managed to say. Then he turned and began the long walk toward the capital, toward the palace where he had once been honored and trusted, toward the king who had scarred him and cast him out, toward a feast where murder was being planned. The silver spoon swung against his chest with each step, catching the afternoon sun like a promise or a warning. The taster was going home. 3 days later, Kofi stood in the shadows outside the palace gates, watching the celebration unfold. The massive walls were draped with colorful Kent cloth in patterns of gold, red, and green. Drummers filled the air with rhythmic beats that made the ground vibrate. People streamed through the open gates, nobles in fine clothes, merchants hoping to do business, performers with their instruments, and hundreds of common people like himself, drawn by the promise of free food and the spectacle of a royal wedding. The palace looked exactly as Kofi remembered it. The same towering mud brick walls decorated with intricate geometric patterns. The same flowering trees in the courtyards, flame trees with their brilliant red blossoms, fragrant frangipani, spreading baobabs. The same golden gates that had once opened for him with respect and now stood as a barrier he had to sneak through. Kofi pulled his hood lower over his scarred face and joined the crowd of beggars and common folk being admitted to the outer courtyards. Guards waved them through with barely a glance. Why would they look closely at beggars? They were invisible beneath notice. That invisibility was Kofi's greatest weapon now. The outer courtyard was already packed with people. Long tables had been set up, loaded with food for the masses, fried plantains, bean cakes, roasted corn, bowls of groundnut soup. It was generous, but it was nothing compared to the feast being prepared in the great hall for the nobles and royal family. Kofi positioned himself near the entrance to the kitchen compound. From here, he could watch the servants rushing back and forth, carrying trays and pitchers, shouting orders and updates. The organized chaos of preparing a royal feast was something he knew intimately. He had spent years navigating these rhythms, understanding the flow of food from kitchen to table. Some of the older servants he recognized. There was Aba, the head cook, her face creased with concentration as she supervised 3 cooking fires at once. There was Ya, the wine steward, carefully selecting which pitchers would go to which tables. And there, Kofi's breath caught. There was Nkrumah, the king's chief advisor, speaking quietly to a young servant Kofi didn't recognize. Nkrumah looked prosperous. His cloth was fine, his gold jewelry heavy and expensive. He had aged well, his face still smooth, his bearing confident. He didn't look like a man haunted by murder. He looked like a man who had won. Kofi watched as Nkrumah handed something to the young servant, a small pouch that disappeared quickly into the servant's clothes. Then Nkrumah patted the young man's shoulder and walked away, his expression pleasant and unremarkable. But Kofi had seen that gesture before. 5 years ago, he had seen Nkrumah speaking to a different servant in exactly the same way. That servant had disappeared the night Queen Alma died, never to be found. Kofi's heart began to race. It was happening again. Just as he had suspected. He pushed through the crowd, trying to follow the young servant, but there were too many people. By the time Kofi reached the kitchen entrance, the servant had vanished into the maze of cooking fires, storage rooms, and bustling workers. "You, get out of here." A guard shoved Kofi backward. "No beggars in the kitchen area." Kofi stumbled back into the crowd, his mind racing. He had to get into the Great Hall. He had to see what was happening at the royal table. But how? He was just a scarred beggar. The Great Hall would be filled with nobles, chiefs, and important guests. Security would be tight. Unless... Kofi looked down at his ragged clothes, his dirty hands, his beggar's appearance. Then he looked at the musicians gathering near the Great Hall entrance, drummers, kora players, dancers in colorful costumes. They were being organized by a harried-looking coordinator who was checking names against a list. Kofi approached a drummer who sat slightly apart from the others, tuning his instrument. "Brother," Kofi said quietly, "I need your help." The drummer looked up, saw Kofi's scarred face, and started to turn away. "Wait," Kofi said urgently. "I'll pay you." He pulled out a small silver ring, the only thing of value he still owned, a gift from his mother before she died. "This ring for your drum and your place in the performance." The drummer's eyes widened. The ring was worth more than he'd earn in months. "Why would you want to?" "Please," Kofi interrupted. "Someone's life depends on it. I swear I mean no harm. I just need to be in the Great Hall." The drummer studied Kofi's face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "Can you play?" "Enough not to disgrace you," Kofi said. In his youth, before becoming a taster, he had learned basic drumming. He prayed he still remembered. They made the exchange quickly. Kofi took the drum and joined the back of the musicians' group. When the coordinator checked his name, Kofi mumbled something unintelligible and kept his head down. The coordinator, overwhelmed and rushed, waved him through without a second glance. And just like that, Kofi was inside. The Great Hall took his breath away. It had been magnificent 5 years ago, but this was something beyond magnificent. The ceiling was draped with thousands of strands of colored cloth, creating a canopy of rainbows. Gold ornaments hung everywhere, catching the light from hundreds of oil lamps. The smell of incense mixed with roasting meat and spices created an intoxicating perfume. The musicians were positioned in an alcove along the side wall, giving Kofi a perfect view of the royal table on the raised platform at the far end of the hall. And there, seated at the center of that table, was King Osei. Kofi's hands trembled on the drum. The king looked so much older. His hair had gone completely gray, and he had lost weight. His face was lined with what looked like permanent sorrow. But his eyes still held the same fierce intelligence Kofi remembered. Next to the king sat Princess Adwoa, radiant in her bridal cloth of white and gold. Kofi remembered her as a child, laughing as she ran through the palace gardens. Now she was a woman, beautiful and poised, but with a nervous energy about her as she glanced at her new husband. Prince Kwame sat beside her, tall and serious, his northern kingdom's colors of blue and silver bright against his dark skin. He seemed kind, the way he kept leaning over to whisper reassurances to his nervous bride. And standing behind the king, ever present, was Nkrumah. The chief advisor surveyed the hall with the satisfaction of a man who had orchestrated everything perfectly. The feast began with prayers and blessings from the priests. Then the eating started. Kofi pretended to play his drum while his eyes tracked every movement. Servants brought dish after dish to the royal table. Whole roasted guinea fowl, fish prepared 3 different ways, mounds of fufu with rich soups, vegetables in groundnut sauce, fried plantains, rice dishes fragrant with spices. The nobles laughed and ate. Musicians played. Dancers twirled in the center of the hall. Everything seemed joyful. Perfect, exactly as a wedding feast should be. But Kofi's trained eyes saw what others missed. He saw the young servant, the one Nkrumah had given the pouch to, emerge from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of palm wine. The servant's hands were shaking slightly. His eyes darted nervously around the room. Kofi's stomach clenched. This was it. The young servant approached the royal table. The wine steward, nodded at him and pointed to several cups that needed filling. Kofi watched in horror as the servant poured wine into cup after cup. Then he reached King Ose's golden cup, a new one, commissioned after Queen Alma's death, but gold like hers had been, and he paused. It was so subtle. Just a moment's hesitation. His hand moved to his pocket where the pouch was hidden.
Kofi didn't think.
He couldn't. There was no time for thinking. He stood up abruptly, his drum falling to the floor with a loud thump that made people jump. Before anyone could stop him, he was running. "Stop!" Kofi screamed, his voice cutting through the music and laughter. "Don't drink it. The wine is poisoned." The great hall erupted into chaos. Guards rushed toward Kofi from all directions. Nobles scrambled away from their tables. Princess Adwoa screamed. The young servant dropped his pitcher, and palm wine splashed across the platform floor like blood. 2 guards tackled Kofi, slamming him to the ground. Pain exploded through his body. But through the tangle of arms and legs, Kofi saw King Ose standing, saw him holding his golden cup, saw the wine inside catching the lamplight, and saw recognition dawn on the king's face as their eyes met across the hall. "You," King Ose whispered, his voice somehow carrying through the chaos. "The taster." They held Kofi in a storage room while arguments raged outside. Through the heavy wooden door, he could hear voices, angry, frightened, demanding. "He's clearly mad. He attacked the king, the same man who killed the queen. Throw him in the dungeons." But one voice cut through all the others, calm and commanding. "Bring him to my private chamber."
"Now."
King Ose's voice. 2 guards hauled Kofi to his feet and marched him through the palace corridors. He caught glimpses of the chaos he'd caused, guests being ushered out, servants whispering, Princess Adwoa crying in her husband's arms. The king's private chamber was simpler than Kofi remembered, almost sparse. The elaborate decorations were gone. It looked like the room of a man who had lost interest in beauty. King Ose sat in a carved wooden chair, his face unreadable. Nkrumah stood beside him, his expression one of concerned sympathy. Princess Adwoa and Prince Kwame were there too, along with the other wine steward, who held the king's golden cup. The guards forced Kofi to his knees. "Leave us," the king said quietly. When Nkrumah started to protest, Ose raised his hand. "All of you, except Nkrumah, and bring the palace healer." When the room had cleared, King Ose stood and walked slowly toward Kofi. For a long moment, he simply stared at the scar he himself had carved. "Why did you come back?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you I would kill you if I ever saw you again." "To save your life, my king," Kofi said. His throat was dry, his voice rough. The wine was poisoned, just like Queen Alma's was. "Preposterous." Nkrumah interjected. "This madman disrupted the princess's wedding with paranoid delusions." "My king, he's clearly—" "Test the wine," Kofi interrupted, looking directly at the king. "Use my spoon. I have nothing to gain by lying." King Ose's eyes dropped to the silver spoon still hanging around Kofi's neck. His hand trembled slightly as he gestured Tia. "Bring the cup here." The wine steward approached nervously, holding the golden cup as if it might explode. King Ose took it and dipped his finger into the wine. He touched the finger to his tongue. His face went white. "Bitter," he whispered. Like almonds." The room went deathly silent. "My king," Nkrumah said quickly. "Perhaps some of the herbs in the wine?"
"No."
King Ose's voice was sharp. "I know this taste. I tasted it 5 years ago when I kissed Alma goodbye. Her lips were bitter with it." He turned to Nkrumah, and for the first time, there was suspicion in his eyes. "Fetch the healer. Have this wine tested."
"Now."
Nkrumah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. But Kofi saw it, and so did the king. "Now," Ose repeated, his voice like iron. Nkrumah left, and the silence stretched. Kofi remained on his knees, hardly daring to breathe. This was the moment. Either the king would believe him, or Kofi would die in this room. "Talk," King Ose commanded. "Tell me everything. Why you think the wine was poisoned. Why you risked your life to warn me." So Kofi talked. He told the king about the 5 years he'd spent learning about poisons, about how he'd replayed that terrible night over and over in his mind, analyzing every detail, about the pitcher he'd tasted from being clean, but the queen's cup being poisoned. "You fill her cup yourself," Kofi said. "I remember. It was a gesture of love." Everyone remarked on it. "I did," the king whispered. "But how?" The poison was already in the cup. Someone coated the inside before the feast. King Ose's breathing quickened. "Who brought me the cup that night?" "Nkrumah, my king." He said he'd polished it himself. The king's hands clenched into fists. "Go on." Kofi told him about Nkrumah's brother being chief advisor to the northern king, about the marriage alliance that Queen Alma had opposed, about how her death had cleared the way for Princess Adwoa's marriage to Prince Kwame. "With you dead tonight, my king, the princess would become queen, married to a northern prince. The kingdoms would unite under the guidance of 2 advisors, Nkrumah and his brother. It's the perfect plan." The door opened and the palace healer entered, his face grave. "My king, I've tested the wine. It contains extract of bitter cassava root and crushed oleander seeds. Enough to kill within minutes." King Ose closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet with tears. "It's all true," he whispered. "All of it. Nkrumah killed Alma. He tried to kill me. And I." He looked at Kofi, really looked at him, seeing the scar, the ragged clothes, the 5 years of suffering written on his face. "I destroyed the one man who might have discovered the truth. I scarred you. I exiled you. I made you into someone who had nothing left to lose," Kofi said quietly. "Someone who could see clearly because he had no position to protect, no reputation to preserve. You freed me to search for the truth, my king, even if that wasn't your intention. That's a generous interpretation of what I did to you. Perhaps. But it's also true." Before the king could respond, the door burst open. Nkrumah stood there, flanked by a dozen soldiers in palace guard uniforms. But something was wrong. These guards wore their armor differently. Their weapons were drawn. "I'm afraid King Ose is unwell," Nkrumah said, his pleasant mask finally cracking. His voice was cold now, all pretense gone. "This scarred madman has poisoned his mind with lies. For the safety of the kingdom, I'm taking both of them into protective custody." "Nkrumah, what are you doing?" King Ose demanded, stepping in front of Kofi. "These men aren't my guards." "No," Nkrumah agreed. "They're mine. Men loyal to the true vision of what our kingdoms can become. Men who understand that sentiment and weakness have no place in building an empire." He drew a jeweled dagger from his belt. "You were always too soft, Ose. Alma made you weak with her talk of peace and allowing people to choose their own paths. The kingdoms should have united years ago. Under strong leadership, we could rule from the coast to the desert." "Under your leadership," Kofi said, still on his knees. "Under competent leadership," Nkrumah corrected. "I tried to make this easy. The queen dies of poison. Tragic, but these things happen. The heartbroken king dies at his daughter's wedding. Grief, everyone would say. So poetic. The young queen, guided by wise advisors from both kingdoms, unites the realms in peace and prosperity. You murdered my wife." King Ose's voice cracked with rage and grief. "I removed an obstacle," Nkrumah said coldly. "And I tried to remove you, the taster. You were supposed to drink yourself to death or die in a ditch somewhere. I needed you gone. Needed the king without his most perceptive servant." He smiled at Kofi. "But you survived. And you learned. I suppose I should have killed you properly." "You're going to kill us now?" the king asked.
Sadly, yes.
"The mad taster attacked you both. I arrived too late to save you." Nkrumah's soldiers moved forward, swords raised. But before they could strike, the door exploded inward. Princess Adwoa stood there, her bridal cloth torn, her face fierce with rage. Behind her stood Prince Kwame and a dozen warriors wearing the Northern Kingdom's colors. "I heard everything," Adwoa said, her voice shaking but strong. "We all did. We were listening at the door." Prince Kwame's face was dark with fury. My father knew nothing of his plot. When he learns that his own brother's advisor conspired to murder a neighboring king and implicate our family, he drew his sword. Nkrumah, you've not only dishonored yourself, you've brought shame upon both our kingdoms. Nkrumah's soldiers hesitated, suddenly outnumbered. Their loyalty clearly didn't extend to fighting a war. It's over, King Osei said quietly. Surrender, Nkrumah. At least face your crimes with some dignity. But Nkrumah's eyes had gone wild. No, I was so close. Years of planning, years of waiting. He lunged toward the king, dagger raised. Kofi moved without thinking. 5 years of surviving on the streets had made him quick. He rolled forward, his silver spoon somehow in his hand, and slashed upward. The spoon's edge caught Nkrumah's wrist. It wasn't sharp, but the impact made the advisor drop his dagger. Prince Kwame's warriors were on him instantly, forcing him to the ground. The room was silent except for Nkrumah's heavy breathing and muffled curses. King Osei knelt beside Kofi and helped him stand. The king's hands were gentle on Kofi's arms, so different from the last time he had touched him. Thank you, the king whispered. For everything. For seeing the truth. For having the courage to return. For saving my life. His voice broke. For forgiving me. I haven't forgiven you yet, my king, Kofi said honestly. King Osei nodded, tears streaming down his face. I understand. I don't deserve. But I will, Kofi continued. Because holding on to hatred would make me just like him. He gestured at Nkrumah, who was being dragged away, still screaming about destiny and power and vision. The trial lasted 3 days. Nkrumah stood before the council of chiefs, nobles, and representatives from both kingdoms. The evidence was overwhelming. The young servant, terrified and guilty, confessed everything. He revealed the pouch of poison Nkrumah had given him. He admitted to coating Queen Amma's cup 5 years earlier, though he'd been told it was just a sleeping draught to help the queen rest. Other servants came forward with stories of Nkrumah's secret meetings, his coded messages to his brother in the north, his careful manipulation of King Osei after the queen's death. The healer presented his analysis of the poison, the same mixture in both the queen's cup and the king's wine, identical in composition and potency. Through it all, Nkrumah remained defiant. I regret nothing, he shouted. I tried to build something great. You're all fools, clinging to old ways, old sentiments. History will prove I was right. The council was unanimous. Nkrumah was sentenced to death for the murder of Queen Amma and the attempted murder of King Osei. His co-conspirators received lesser sentences: exile, imprisonment, loss of property. Prince Kwame's father, the northern king, sent a formal apology and immediately removed Nkrumah's brother from his position. The marriage alliance between Princess Adwoa and Prince Kwame would stand, but it would be a true alliance now, built on genuine respect rather than manipulation. After the trial, King Osei summoned Kofi to the throne room. This time, the room was filled with people, nobles, servants, citizens. The king wanted witnesses to what came next. Kofi stood before the throne in new clothes, simple but clean. His scarred face was uncovered. He had stopped hiding it. King Osei rose and, to everyone's shock, descended from his throne and knelt before Kofi. Gasps echoed through the chamber. A king kneeling before a subject was unheard of. My king, Kofi started. No, Osei said firmly. Let me speak from this position. Let everyone see that I mean what I say. He looked up at Kofi, his eyes red from crying. I took everything from you. Your position, your honor, your face, your life. I cannot undo what I did. The 5 years you suffered, the pain I caused, I cannot take that back. The king's voice cracked. I was mad with grief, but madness is not an excuse. I failed you as surely as I failed Amma. No. More than I failed her, because I failed you deliberately, cruelly. Kofi felt tears on his own cheeks. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd come to save the king, to prevent another murder, to expose the truth. He hadn't thought beyond that. I can only offer you everything I have, King Osei continued. Anything you want is yours. A position in the palace? It's yours. Gold, land, servants, a title? All yours. I will make a proclamation that you are a hero of the kingdom. Your name will be honored forever. Just tell me what you want and I will give it. The throne room was silent. Everyone waited for Kofi's answer. Kofi looked at the king kneeling before him. He looked at Princess Adwoa, who watched with tears streaming down her face. He looked at all the nobles and servants, at the golden throne, at the magnificent palace that had once been his home. And then he touched the silver spoon hanging around his neck. I want 3 things, my king, Kofi said quietly. Name them.
Anything.
First, I want justice for everyone affected by Nkrumah's plot. The families of those who died or suffered. They deserve compensation and recognition. King Osei nodded immediately. It will be done. Second, I want a pension for all the servants and workers who lost their positions because they were loyal to me. They suffered for my disgrace through no fault of their own. Agreed, the king said. What is your third request? Kofi took a deep breath. I want to return to Bakoro. Not as the royal taster. Not as a noble or advisor or hero. Just as Kofi, a man with a silver spoon who knows something about cooking and healing. Let me teach the children about herbs and safety. Let me live simply, quietly. Let me be free. The throne room erupted in whispers. The king stared at Kofi in disbelief. That's all? Osei asked. After everything I took from you, all you want is freedom? Kofi smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, the smile didn't hurt. My king, you cannot give me back the years I lost. The scar will always be there. The memories will always hurt. But you can give me peace. You can let this story end not with revenge or bitterness, but with forgiveness and a new beginning. You shame me with your mercy, the king whispered. No, Kofi said gently, helping the king to his feet. I free us both. Hatred is heavier than hunger, my king. I've carried both, and I'm tired of the weight. Princess Adwoa stepped forward and took Kofi's scarred hand in both of hers. You saved my father twice. Once from poison, and once from the poison of living with injustice. Thank you. Prince Kwame approached and bowed deeply. My kingdom will hear this story. We will teach our children about the taster who chose wisdom over vengeance, who proved that those society discards are often the very ones who save it. King Osei embraced Kofi, and the entire throne room witnessed their reconciliation. When they finally stepped apart, the king said, I cannot undo your scar, but I can give it new meaning. Let it be known throughout both kingdoms that this mark represents not failure, but the courage to forgive. The wisdom to seek justice without becoming consumed by revenge. In the days that followed, the kingdom buzzed with the story. Songs were written about the taster who saved the king. Artists painted scenes of Kofi's bravery. But the real changes happened more quietly. The families of Nkrumah's victims received justice and support. Servants who had lost their positions were reinstated with back pay and honors. Reforms were made in how the royal household was run, with new safeguards against poison and conspiracy. Princess Adwoa's marriage to Prince Kwame stood, but now it was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not political manipulation. The two kingdoms began cooperating as equals, not as territories to be merged under one ruler's ambition. And King Osei, he changed. The grief that had made him cruel began to heal into something gentler. He established a foundation in Queen Amma's name to help those who had been wrongly accused or unjustly punished. He visited the villages regularly, listening to his people rather than just ruling them. On the morning Kofi prepared to leave the capital, the king walked with him to the gates. In his hands, King Osei carried a wooden box. I know you refused wealth, the king said, but please take this. Inside the box were seeds, medicinal herbs, cooking spices, rare plants from across the kingdom. For your teaching, Osei explained, and for your garden, so you can help others learn what you've learned. Kofi accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. Thank you, my king. Will you? The king hesitated. Will you ever come back? To visit?
Kofi thought about it.
Perhaps. When enough time has passed. When we've both healed a bit more. They embraced one final time, and then Kofi walked through the golden gates, heading toward Bokoro. The journey took 3 days. When Kofi finally arrived in the village, Efua was at her bean cake stall, just as before. But this time, when she saw him coming, she smiled broadly. "You're alive," she exclaimed. "We heard stories that you saved the king, exposed a murderer, refused a fortune." "Stories get exaggerated," Kofi said, settling down beside her stall. "But yes, I'm alive. And I'm home." "Home," Efua repeated. "So you're staying?" "I am. I thought I might teach. Share what I've learned about herbs and healing and cooking. If people will listen to a scarred man with a silver spoon." Efua laughed. "I think you'll find people are eager to learn from the hero of the kingdom." "I'm not a hero," Kofi protested. "No," Efua agreed. "You're something better. You're a good man who did the right thing even when it cost you everything. That's rarer than heroism." Over the following months, Kofi built a new life in Bokoro. He created a garden where he grew medicinal herbs and taught children how to identify them. He helped the village cooks improve their recipes and food safety. He told a story to anyone who would listen, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson about the danger of rushing to judgment and the power of choosing forgiveness. The silver spoon never left his neck. People would ask about it, and he would smile. "It's a reminder," he would say, "that the smallest things can matter most. A spoon, a kind word, a moment of courage. And it reminds me that even when we lose everything, we can still choose who we want to be." Children gathered around him in the market square, just as they had gathered around storytellers for generations. They would trace the scar on his face with curious fingers, and he would let them. "Does it hurt?" they would ask. "Not anymore," he would answer truthfully. "Now it's just a part of my story." And every story, even the painful ones, can teach us something valuable. One afternoon, nearly a year after his return, a royal messenger arrived in Bokoro. The entire village gathered as he read the proclamation. "By order of King Ose, let it be known throughout the kingdom that Kofi, called the Taster, is hereby honored as a keeper of truth. Any who harm him or speak falsely of him will answer to the king himself. Further, a school of herbalism and healing is to be established in Bokoro, with Kofi as its head, funded by the royal treasury." The villagers erupted in cheers. But Kofi just smiled quietly and touched his silver spoon. That evening, Efua found him sitting under the baobab tree, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You're famous now," she said, sitting beside him. "The hero who refused to be a hero." "I just wanted peace," Kofi said. "And maybe to help others avoid the mistakes that almost destroyed me." "What mistakes?" "The king's mistake of acting in anger without seeking the full truth. Nkrumah's mistake of thinking power and control matter more than people. My own mistake of thinking I was worthless because others said I was." He held up his spoon, watching it catch the dying light. "We all carry something that others might think is useless or broken. But sometimes those broken, useless things are exactly what saves us." Efua was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you came back. Not just for what you did at the palace, but for what you're doing here. Teaching us, helping us, showing us that kindness is stronger than revenge." Kofi looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her warm smile, her generous heart, the way she had given him food when he was just a scarred stranger. "Thank you," he said, "for being the first person to see me as human again." As the years passed, Kofi's school grew. Students came from across both kingdoms to learn about herbs, poisons, healing, and food safety. But more than that, they learned about integrity, about choosing truth over convenience, about the courage it takes to forgive. Kofi never returned to the palace. He didn't need to. The life he built in Bokoro was richer than any position at court could have been. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would take out his silver spoon and remember everything it had witnessed. The glory days in the palace, the terrible night of the queen's death, The 5 years of wandering and learning, the moment he chose to save rather than seek revenge, and all the small daily acts of kindness that had brought him to this peaceful place. The spoon was tarnished now, no longer polished bright. But Kofi liked it that way. It looked like what it was, something that had been through fire and darkness and had emerged still whole, still useful, still capable of nourishing life. Just like him. And when children asked him to tell the real story, not the songs and legends, Kofi would smile his crooked smile and begin. Once, there was a man who lost everything. His face, his name, his place in the world. Everyone called him cursed and useless. But he learned that even the smallest person, carrying the smallest thing, can change the course of kingdoms. Not through violence or revenge, but through the courage to seek truth and the wisdom to choose forgiveness. And the silver spoon? The children would ask. What happened to it? Kofi would hold it up, letting it catch the light. It's still here, still serving, still reminding me that our value doesn't come from what others think of us, but from how we choose to live when no one is watching. The spoon saved a king, yes. But more importantly, it saved me by reminding me who I was when everyone else forgot. The children would nod solemnly, understanding in the way that children do that they were hearing something important, something to carry with them through their own lives. And somewhere in the capital, King Ose would look out over his kingdom and think of the scarred taster who had taught him that true strength lies not in power or control, but in the ability to admit wrong, to seek forgiveness, and to change. 2 kingdoms, united not by conquest or manipulation, but by a shared lesson learned from the most unlikely of teachers, that those we throw away, those we call useless, those we mark as failures, they might just be the ones who save us all. If only we have the wisdom to listen.